In 1990, the rich family's dream home in Wales had twisted into a nightmare. What had started as slamming doors and unexplained footsteps had spiralled into an evil presence in the house that seemed hell-bent on tearing them apart. But it was only going to get so much worse. Paintings cursed with death, towering shadow figures radiating pure malevolence, and a descent into madness so deep that some say even after the hundreds of exorcisms conducted on the place, it never truly went away. This is the story of Heol Fanog, Britain's most exorcised home. And now in part 2, the activity is going to escalate, and the riches will fight back with everything they've got. But was Heol Fanog truly ever cleansed of the evil that tormented the family for years? Or is that malevolent energy still waiting for its next victim? So last week in part 1, we found out all about Bill Rich, his wife Liz, Bill's son Lawrence and the couple's baby Ben, and got into how their dream home really did turn into this unimaginable nightmare for them all. And then how the poltergeist activity got worse and worse until the family were at breaking point. And if you missed part 1, I'll try and give you all the context you need, but honestly, you just want to go back and binge the full story later on because it is so terrifying. But for now, we're getting right back into the nightmare that was the Rich family's life in the spring of 1990, because Bill's hands weren't showing any signs of healing whatsoever after whatever it was that was going on with them, why they were so red and cracked and sore. And to them, that's when the haunting crossed the line from tormenting them to physically harming them. At the same time, Lawrence, Bill's now 15-year-old son, had morphed into this seething, foul-mouthed ball of fury. And sure, teenagers can be a lot, but this felt darker than just puberty. And after the, let's just call it what it was, a failed exorcism, that had only cranked the activity up even worse, and the family were desperate for answers. So they turned to Ray Williams, head of the Christian Spiritualist Church in Cardiff. Ray came to the house in 1990 and almost immediately he zeroed in on Lawrence. Because if you know even the basics of quote-unquote usual poltergeist cases, and yes, I know how ridiculous that sounds, poltergeist cases being a regular occurrence and all of that, the pattern is nearly always the same though. There's emotional turmoil in the house plus a teenager going through puberty. Both of those boxes, yeah, Lawrence ticked. Bill divorcing Lawrence's mom, moving into a new house, new stepmom, new baby, and now him turning 15, right in the middle of it all. And Ray's advice was pretty blunt. Get Lawrence out. The energy was feeding on him, changing him. But Bill and Liz, they couldn't stomach that. Like, sure, okay, yes, Lawrence was being a nightmare, but banishing your kid, that felt unthinkable, even in the context of dealing with 4-figure electricity bills and apparitions around every corner. But at this point, Liz was actually pregnant again with her and Bill's second baby. Yeah. So I mean, if one step-sibling was enough to turn Lawrence into a fire-breathing dragon, maybe don't test what happens when baby number 2 arrives. When Ray visited though, he wasn't alone. He brought along a man called Larry Harry. And yes, that is genuinely his name, absolutely brilliant, but he would later return to the house for a second visit. And when he returned, he brought with him a few mediums from the Netherlands. Because this was the thing that the newspaper article talking about the hauntings had opened up. So many people wanted to come and see the house for themselves and see if they could solve the mystery about what was happening at Heol Fanog. And this gang, they tried to do what they could for the riches. They cleansed Bill and Liz's auras and put up what they described as a psychic wall around Heol Fanog, but they also told the family what they had picked up on, because it was quite interesting. They said that there was an old woman who was trapped here. Well, that tracks with what Liz had seen in Ben's bedroom. But they also said that there were 2 young men, but they still weren't the root cause of all the evil in the home, because there was another presence, absolutely evil, utterly malevolent and ancient. That was your culprit. Yeah, of course, it was affecting poor Lawrence, but contradicting what Ray had told them previously, Lawrence wasn't the reason that this thing had been tormenting the family. Wait, what? Now we're doing a 180? Really? Apparently so. Because this ancient evil entity was in fact attached to Bill instead. not Lawrence. And the Riches were absolutely astounded. Just what on earth is their life at this point? Literally a year ago, they were looking forward to this fresh start, all love and light. And now, 12 months later, they're being told that there's an evil presence in their house that's just turning their whole world upside down. Not feeling very escape to the country, is it? The group kind of questioned Bill about it. Is there literally anything in your past? Anything at all that you've done? Have you dabbled, Bill? Dabbled in things that you knew nothing about? The way I would be clawing through my memory files in the old brain box, just desperately trying to think of anything. Did I walk under a ladder at some point on a Tuesday afternoon in 2012? Who knows? But Bill, he didn't need to think too hard. He knew what he'd done. He had a feeling he knew the precise moment when he had invited this thing into his life. And it wasn't anything to do with Heol Fanog. It had started years ago while he was still a student. Because his student flat's caretaker was Alex Sanders, the so-called King of the Witches, founder of Alexandrian Wicca. And Sanders once told Bill that he could make him a successful painter if he just became a witch. Bill agreed. Heck yeah, let's do this. And the ritual began. But halfway through, with the words already spoken and the intention set, Bill panicked and backed out, walking away before the ritual was finished. And so talking to the mediums, maybe that was where it had all started. Just by initiating the ritual, he'd opened up a door that couldn't be closed. Of course, no one could say for sure, but in fairness, did seem pretty damning. Why was Bill the one to pretty much lose his business, to have a painful and physical reaction with whatever was going on with his hands? It seemed like he was being the most affected. But either way, it was a lot for both the group of mediums and the Riches to ruminate on, so that was that for that visit. There was also the ever-present advice in the back of their minds, though, about Lawrence. If this thing truly is as evil as everyone is telling us it is, maybe we should revisit the conversation about getting him out of the house to a safer place. Even if he isn't the cause of the activity, he really does not seem to be doing very well here. And so eventually they decided, yeah, let's try it, see how it goes. And so Lawrence was sent to a boarding house in Brecon, just 10 minutes away from them. But I mean, you can just imagine the hatred that Lawrence would have had in that moment. How he would have felt about that. Dad's just kicked me out of the house he shares with his new wife and kid, and another kid on the way. He was not happy about it. And obviously the guilt was eating Bill up inside about the whole situation. But as the days went on, the activity did seem to calm somewhat after Lawrence had left. The footsteps and apparitions had been reduced more to just that unnerving background presence. Still there, but not as viscerally terrifying. Okay, maybe it was the right thing to do. But as Lawrence's parent, Bill was never going to feel totally okay with it, obviously. But one day, a bit later on, Bill bumped into his neighbour, the same one who'd once warned him that nothing good ever came of Heol Fanog. This time though, the neighbour had a more positive thing to say and actually had a job for him. He wanted Bill to paint a portrait of their favourite horse, Echo, who was this gorgeous jet black cob. Bill was thinking, yep, sounds good, I need the money, let's do it. And so as much as he could, Bill tried to put the whole Lawrence situation out of his mind and just threw himself into this work. But also, he did need something else to take the edge off and started drinking pretty heavily. But the painting still came together brilliantly, it looked awesome, apart from one detail he just couldn't get right. Echo's back right leg. No matter how many times he tried, something about it just looked wrong. In the end, he settled, it looked close enough and no one just looking at the painting was going to notice that anything was wrong. And so he finished the background using a nearby field for reference and handed it over. The neighbour loved it and paid Bill generously for the work. Wow, did something just go off without a hitch? It seemed so. I think you know by now though that it was not going to be that easy. A few days went by when Bill got a phone call from this neighbour's wife, and her tone was pretty cold, almost accusatory, but she informed him that Echo had to be put down. And Bill was obviously very sympathetic. Oh no, I'm really sorry to hear that, like what's happened? So the wife went on to explain that, yeah, we don't really know. Echo was out in his field and he just developed this problem with one of his legs. Wouldn't come right, steroids wouldn't touch it, vets had no idea what was going on with it, and eventually it had got so bad that Echo was in so much pain and they had to make the decision to put him to sleep. Bill's there like, oh my god, that's absolutely heartbreaking, how awful, I'm so sorry for your loss. The wife said yeah, and she kind of paused for a moment before saying, yeah, it was really sad, and we couldn't really wrap our heads around it until we looked at the portrait that you had painted and realised that Echo had died in the exact spot that you had painted him in. The same field, the same angle, everything. And hearing that, you can just imagine the cold, creeping dread that would have been spreading throughout Bill's body. Because the next thing he asked was, what leg was the problem? It was the back right leg. The same one that Bill hadn't been able to paint right. Jeez, talk about a freaking rug pull. The neighbours didn't necessarily blame Bill for what had happened, and I mean, they clearly knew. They had some sort of idea about what was going on at Heol Fanog anyway, but they burnt the painting and they never spoke to the Riches again. Well, that was it for Bill. He started turning more and more inward, working hours and hours on end in his studio. He started drinking more and more, and his paintings were getting darker and darker, to the extent that Liz actually started to get concerned about him. Mere months ago, he couldn't paint without being in agony with his hands. Yet here he was. The affliction still going strong, hadn't gone anywhere, but he was just painting away constantly. By that point, the footsteps, the door slams, the smells of sulphur and incense, the temperature spikes and dips, and that intense, dreadful feeling that followed them all through the house, all of it had come back full force. And after Liz gave birth on the 19th of December 1990 to their daughter Rebecca, the activity kicked up a notch yet again. Both Bill and Liz started noticing more shadow figures all throughout the house. The way I would be so out. I mean, I wouldn't still be here by this point anyway, but shadow figures in my house? Nope, not okay with that development at all. But Liz also started to notice a figure standing outside, staring at the house. Thinking it was a trespasser, maybe some local weirdo had heard about the haunting through the newspaper, she would run out to chase them off, only to find that they'd completely disappeared. And that's easy to dismiss the first couple of times, but she kept seeing this figure again and again, always in the same spot and always gone by the time she got out there, with not a single trace anyone had been standing there at all. But even though Liz had 2 young children to look after, she'd never stopped trying to look into the history of the house, seeing if there was anything at all that might help explain what had been going on. She actually met with a local historian to see if anything could come to light, and the historian, you could say she delivered. She did mention to Liz that their exorcism that they'd had on the house, well, that was talk of the town. No secrets in a place like Brecon, everybody knows everyone's business. But the historian went on to say that, of course, it wasn't the first time that Heol Fanog had had an exorcism done on the place. Wait, hang on, let's just rewind. What? This was news to Liz, that someone else had had an exorcism on the place before the Riches had moved in. Okay. Oh yeah, the historian said, back in the 60s, the old owner of the house, a woman called Marion, she'd had one done, who, as it goes, was the mother of the current landlord of the place. Obviously when she passed away and the son had inherited the house, he'd just started renting it out. But Marion, she had been terrified of the house. We don't know specifically what had gone on, but she was said to have been so scared that she instructed the local vicar to bring the entire church choir with him when he came to exorcise the place. Strength in numbers kind of thing. So that was a very interesting revelation for Liz. But it also connected back to what the plumber had told her about the work that he'd done in the 60s, where he'd installed a new radiator system. But every day it was ripped off the walls until he used screws with the cross on the head instead. Because yeah, that work had been completed while Marion was living in the house. I don't know if the exorcism was before or after that, but even so. Absolutely wild, the dots that were connecting right then. The historian did have one more gift for Liz though, and that was a photograph of Marion herself. And who was staring back at Liz from that old photo? The woman with the grey hair and cardigan. The very same one who Liz had seen on multiple occasions in her son Ben's bedroom. I mean, this right here, this proved to Liz that she wasn't mad. She wasn't seeing things. It wasn't all in her imagination. She had been coming face to face with the former owner of the house, the very same person who was intimately aware of what the Riches had been going through, to the extent that even she had tried to exorcise the house when she was alive too. And maybe that's why she was still here, still seen in Ben's bedroom. Maybe trying to protect him from the evil at Heol Fanog. Or maybe she was just trapped there, like Larry Harry had said. And all of this new information, it felt like they'd turned this page. They still had no idea about the evil that they were up against, but at least they knew part of what was going on in their house. Why this woman had been seen so much. But even so, it felt like any progress the Riches made towards knowing thy enemy and all of that, the house was right there with them. Because as Liz came home one afternoon with the kids, she saw something utterly, disgustingly terrifying. As she opened the door into the house, she came face to face with a towering 7-foot-tall shadow figure. The thing was huge and just radiating pure evil and hate. There were no details, no distinguishing features. This thing was just like an abyss, a bottomless darkness that Liz couldn't look away from. She stood there, frozen, before the figure just turned and walked through the wall. That was it. That felt like another seal had been broken. This unspeakable evil, this ominous presence in the house had never manifested like this, in such a concentrated, hateful mass. Yet now, there it was, standing inside their home. Nope, Liz was not doing this anymore. Her and Bill talked it over, but really there was only one way that this was going to go now. They scooped up the kids, piled into their car, and drove to Liz's mum's house in Cowbridge, about an hour away. They just needed to get out. There was no way they could stay there right now. They knew that eventually they would have to move back, and so again, they reached out to yet another exorcist, desperately hoping that he was going to be able to give them some relief from what they were going through. And David Holmwood, he was a Baptist minister, and unlike others, he didn't rush into the house with holy water. He first wanted to visit the house just for a little bit of a walk around, to get a sense for the place, in June 1991. When he returned a month later, he had prepared himself for a fight, but the house seemed ready too. Literally on his drive over, an owl slammed headfirst into his windscreen, shattering it, which he took as a warning. Whatever was in Heol Fanog did not want him there. Once he arrived at the house though, he honed in straight away on Bill, who, to look at him, you could just tell that he was a shell of himself. Red raw hands, haggard from sleepless nights and hours spent painting, with the alcohol clearly taking a toll as well. It was obvious to David that the evil had latched onto him like a parasite. So David asked Bill a seemingly innocent question. Where do you feel most comfortable in the house, Bill? Where do you feel safe? Immediately, he said his studio. Right then, well that's where we're going to go first. That's where the malevolent energy is going to be strongest. David completed his exorcism and said that he would be back. This wasn't going to be a one and done thing. This energy was too strong, and it was going to be hard. Hard on Bill mostly, as he had to break this attachment, and that started with burning his paintings. All of the dark, evil, horrible things that he had been painting at all hours of the night, that was a connection to this entity, and they had to go. After the exorcism, it was time for the Riches to move back to Heol Fanog. They had 2 young kids. They couldn't live at Liz's mum's permanently. And even though the exorcism had been reassuring, their financial situation was still unbelievably dire. So they had no choice but to very reluctantly return to Heol Fanog. But as promised, David Holmwood started visiting regularly, blessing the house and praying with the Riches. It was his work over something like 18 months that led to the house being called the most exorcised home in Britain. And it did seem to help. The atmosphere lightened a bit, the footsteps slowed down, the figures appeared a little less often, but Bill and Liz never truly believed that it was fully gone. There was always some nagging thought in the back of their mind, and unfortunately that fear was confirmed in the spring of 1993. Bill was in the kitchen when he got that identical feeling that they'd come to dread, that something was watching him, and in his peripheral vision, his heart sank when he realised that there was something there. But when he turned to look, wasn't an old woman or the shadow figure. It was instead this beautiful woman, someone he'd never seen before. And as soon as he faced her, the entire mood of the room changed to be temptation, desire. Nothing like what the house had been before. But Bill quickly got the impression that this figure, she wanted him to follow her as she glided through the house and out of view. But Bill was totally shaken by this. This was something completely different. And so he rang David Holmwood to tell him what had happened immediately. And David, he wasn't the least bit surprised. Bill, you were the one that was most affected in that house, and now it's trying to tempt you, trying to get you to give in again. But you can't, Bill. You have to stay strong. And so if the house wasn't going to get to Bill through temptation, it went back to what had worked before. Fear and torment. As spring 1993 turned to summer, Bill started having unbelievably terrifying nightmares, like pretty much night terrors, realistically speaking, about creatures with bird-like heads and enormous, imposing shadow figures. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, but soon those dreams would actually start to turn into his reality. I just couldn't even imagine being the Riches at this point though. You moved in May 1989. It's now 4-ish years later. You just feel exhausted. Anything that you're doing, it doesn't matter, because whatever it is, it's just relentless. It just keeps on coming at you. Just unimaginable. Bill was once again in the kitchen one day when he turned and came face to face with that terrifying shadow figure just standing there. Its aura was incredibly threatening, obviously, but also mocking him, as in a "you're never gonna get rid of me" kind of vibe. He scrambled up the stairs to go and find Liz and immediately began to pray with her. And she was all a bit turned around like, okay, just a bit confused. But she did what her husband asked her to do. They closed their eyes and prayed for strength, just like David Holmwood had taught them how to do. At some point, Liz opened her eyes to see that the figure that had terrified Bill downstairs was now standing right next to them, looking down at the both of them. There are just so many levels of no in this entire story. My heart rate was going just reading about this bit. Obviously, Liz cried out, absolutely horrified to see this thing so brazenly standing there as if it had every right to be. But they carried on praying and begging for strength and pleading to make this thing go away. Bill kept on trying, but once he said the words, "Please go in the name of Jesus," it was gone. As if someone had flipped a light switch and the huge shape just wasn't there anymore. But it didn't really matter. At that moment, it felt like everything that they had done up until that point, every exorcism that David had performed, clearly it had just been like sticking a plaster over a gaping wound. They weren't any closer to relief from this. The atmosphere had been just as bad as it had ever been. Ben and Becca were super unsettled, and Bill and Liz were just exhausted from constantly feeling like they're being watched, exhausted of the wild mood swings that both of them were going through, and just exhausted from the feeling of pure hatred that the house seemed to be emanating out of it. Liz was now pregnant for a third time, and the thought of bringing another child into this whole thing was just unbearable. Something had to change. On the 29th of July 1993, the Riches turned to another Baptist minister, a guy called John Aston, and he came determined to banish whatever it was that haunted the house. But just like the exorcisms before, his prayers were just swallowed whole by the house. There was a brief moment of relief, but nothing really changed. Bill was falling deeper and deeper into a spiral, drinking, just adamant that he was cursed. Everything was just slowly culminating again. On the 2nd of January 1994, their third kid, Thomas, was born, and as any parent knows, that comes with a whole new level of sleep deprivation, something that was only made worse by everything that Bill and Liz were going through at Heol Fanog. But one afternoon, after the two older kids were winding each other up, Bill went into the kitchen and, just like tunnel vision, noticed a knife had been left out on the side. First of all, he cursed out Liz, like she must have been the one to leave the knife out. Bit irresponsible with Ben and Rebecca about, so he picked it up to put it away. As soon as he touched the handle though, Bill became overwhelmed with a horrible temptation. He felt like he was at the end of his tether. There was nothing left for him to give. He couldn't do this anymore. But he knew deep in the back of his mind that these weren't his thoughts. He'd never contemplated anything like that before. He'd never dream of leaving Liz and the kids on their own without him. So he tried to put the knife down. But it was like trying to force two opposing magnets together. The knife was just repelling the drawer, fighting against Bill. Bill carried on pushing through, fighting just as hard with the thoughts in his head, until he managed to throw the knife in the drawer and slam it shut. He took a breath just to collect himself as normal service resumed in his head, just utterly shocked at what had just overcome him. He turned to leave the kitchen, go and get some fresh air, and just froze. Because there, sitting on the table behind him, was the very same knife that he had just locked away. They didn't have a duplicate, and there was no conceivable way that the knife he'd just shut in the drawer could now be behind him in an instant. Yeah. things were getting this bad. Bill reached out to the local newspaper again, and they ran another article about how the electricity meter was going haywire, tied to all the paranormal activity in the house. And that decision to run another article changed everything, because it caught the eye of none other than renowned paranormal investigator Eddie Burks, and he offered to help. If you don't know who Eddie is, he's a pretty big deal, as he was the guy that the super prestigious bank Coots called in when they were having a little ghost problem scaring all the bank staff. And when I mean prestigious bank, I mean this is where King Charles banks, so you know. But when Eddie visited Heol Fanog, he again didn't have big plans to chase the evil out of the house in the first go. In fact, all he wanted to do was just go and have a walk around the house and just listen to the ghosts, feel the energy, just see what he could pick up. He could feel the malevolence. He knew it was there and it was nasty, but what he honed in on were the two young men. He felt their presence too, just like Larry Harry and the spiritualists had. He went on to say that he could pick up with the first man that this guy had witnessed something awful, something horrific happening on the grounds of the old Heol Fanog manor. Apparently, he'd seen the owner of the manor house murder a young woman in some sort of ritual. And this guy, he was absolutely horrified by what he'd stumbled upon, and so he'd gone and got drunk at the nearby pub where he'd started mouthing off about what he'd seen. But word had got back to the group who had been at the manor when the woman was killed. And so Eddie went on to tune into the second male energy that was trapped at the house, because he was the one who had been sent to silence the first guy. And this whole situation, that's why both of these young men were still there at Heol Fanog. But knowing this, while great, yeah, more information, it didn't solve the Rich's torment. And so Eddie began his own ritual, visualizing light filling the house and beating back the black cloud of evil. Utterly remarkably though, after Eddie was done with his work, for the first time since this whole thing had started, years ago, the electricity meter settled down. The ominous atmosphere shrank back, and the house felt just a little bit bigger, like something had shifted after Eddie had done what he did. No other exorcism had made the type of impact that Eddie had. But just like the rest of the times, slowly, the oppressive energy started to creep back in. The electricity meter started whirring faster and faster again, and it just felt like a big thunderstorm was coming. That anxious, this isn't going to end well type feeling, that was coming back with a vengeance. But Bill and Liz, living in that house after Eddie's ritual, they'd had a taste of what life could be like, and they were not going to let it get as bad as it had before. Immediately, as soon as the footsteps and the door slams and the shadow figures all started back up again, they called Eddie Burks, saying, "You've got to come back round, please, just end it once and for all, because we can't do this anymore." And Eddie agreed. It was time for the final showdown. All or nothing, let's face this entity head on and get rid of it. So on the 8th of June, 1995, Eddie came back to Heol Fanog, and he brought along a little dream team with him, members of the Society for Psychical Research. Ralph Noyes, Montague Keane, and Maurice Gross. The last one you may recognise as the guy who had a big role to play in the Enfield poltergeist case in the 70s. And so Eddie wasted no time and got straight to work, walking through the house, tuning into the energy, and straight away, what hit him with this malevolence was that clearly this was no ordinary ghost. This wasn't going to be as easy as tuning into the two young men like before. What he was picking up on was ancient. And he actually said out loud, "This thing isn't human. It feels pre-Christian, Celtic maybe. It's something that was dragged here through ritual, maybe even a sacrifice, and it was created for malice, but it never left." And all while he was talking this through, Bill was watching him as Eddie's face, you could see he was really concentrating and almost twisting like maybe he was in pain, but it was as if he was fighting something that no one else in the room could see. He kept on talking through what he was doing though, forcing out the words, how he had to strip this thing back and dismantle it and take away the human hatred bound to it and return it to nature. And then, in that moment, the house just changed. You could just feel it instantly as the air went heavy, electric, like every hair on his body stood on end at the same time. And it was almost as if the whole house was just holding its breath. Eddie was still fighting against something unseen, still exerting himself and putting so much concentration and energy into what he was doing, as if he was physically fighting this thing. And then, bang, out of nowhere, this deafening crack tore through the room. It ripped straight out of the tape recorder that the team had set up, as loud as a gunshot, and it was like a lightning bolt had just torn through the machine and then vanished in the blink of an eye. eye, but it just wasn't natural. But after that, silence. Just pure silence. As the Riches looked around, the house, it definitely looked different. Monumentally different, actually. It was lighter and brighter. After 6 years of hell, this was the first time that they allowed themselves to be optimistic and hope beyond all hope that maybe this is over. And from that day, for the Riches, it was. Heol Fanog was finally mercifully quiet. The electricity bill went to less than the average for a house and family of that size. Bill's business boomed with new orders and clients, and the kids all seemed happier, brighter, and more carefree, like children should be. Even Lawrence, who had thrived outside of Heol Fanog, he started visiting the house more and more, and actually at one point he pulled his dad to the side to thank him for what he'd done. Thank you for getting me out of that house. It was the best thing you could have ever done for me. The year after, in 1996, Liz's granddad passed away and left her a bit of money. Nothing extravagant, but enough for the family to be able to afford to buy a house of their own. And while they'd not even experienced so much as a whiff of sulphur since that day in June 1995, the Riches were out of there. There was just too many bad memories. The 6 long years leading up to Eddie's final visit had been just too brutal. They knew they needed the fresh start that they had been desperately looking for way back in 1989. And so they left Heol Fanog. But to this day, Liz suspects that maybe Heol Fanog never left Bill. Because even though the activity stopped and the family moved out, Bill continued to drink heavily. He lost his license because of drink driving, but carried on anyway. Sometimes Rebecca would see him pouring a glass of wine at 11 in the morning as if it was the most normal thing in the world. And eventually his health spiraled and his marriage to Liz broke down, and in 2016 Bill Rich passed away. And so it obviously does just leave you wondering, was it just Bill's own demons catching up to him, or was it the profound impact that living at Heol Fanog had on him that caused him to carry on drinking? Or was it that some of that darkness that had its claws so deeply in him was still there and he could never escape from it? Whatever it is, I really do hope he is at peace now. And as for Liz, she's taken part in a BBC podcast with Danny Robbins called The Witch Farm, and I've seen that she's been somewhat active in uncanny Facebook groups and things talking about what happened. But their story in the years since, it's been told and retold. The author Mark Chadbourn wrote his book on the haunting called Testimony, and there was also an episode of the most terrifying TV show, True Horror. Don't watch that one alone in the dark, trust me. But one really important detail that came out in Witch Farm was that the current residents of the house, number 1, wanted no part in any of the stories or anything like that, but number 2, they said that definitively there hasn't been a single weird moment in the house. Heol Fanog has always felt warm and welcoming, and there were always so many birds. Where have we heard that part before? When Bridget Buscombe, the previous tenant, told Liz all about her experience living in the house, she mentioned all the birds too. So while today Heol Fanog may seem like a little slice of heaven tucked away in the Welsh countryside, what the Riches went through here for years, all the torment and the fear and the exorcisms, does make you wonder if the house is only ever peaceful until the wrong family move in. But really, maybe the bigger question here is, what on earth was that? That whole story was utterly wild, terrifying. Mind you, was on the floor at multiple points during the research for this one. And obviously everyone has an opinion on this story, so I'm going to try and talk about as many as I can. But first of all, we've got to talk about the human aspect to all of this. The activity really started once they brought Ben home from the hospital. New parents, sleep-deprived new parents, and then with Lawrence going through this massive shift in dynamics with a new stepbrother, that's going to be a heck of a lot to process, so no wonder he lashed out the way he did. So it could have just been that Lawrence was growing up, going through puberty, because his mom did actually visit the house and she didn't think anything was wrong. She was never worried for him. And his teachers, they never raised concerns about Lawrence either. It only seemed to be when he was in the house that he would turn evil. So could it have been something more physical, like carbon monoxide poisoning or something like that? Over 6 years, that kind of seems unlikely. So could it have been something to do with the paints that Bill was using maybe? Were they messing with the senses? Were they causing hallucinations? And that's why Lawrence felt better once he was out of the house? Again, could be a possibility, but that doesn't explain what was going on with the electric meter and why it stopped playing up as soon as that final exorcism. Some people point to dodgy electrics, maybe earthing or a hidden fault or something like that, but what sticks out is that the meter always went wild wild when the activity did, and stopped the second the final exorcism was done, which is just so much harder to explain away. And so maybe it wasn't that the electricity was leaking out to ground, maybe the ground itself, the land, the former estate of the Heol Fanog manor house, it was actually cursed. One of the many people who visited the Riches during the haunting was a dowser called Dickie Dodds. Yet again, another great name. But he raised the theory that there were ley lines running all across the property, which if you don't know, they're lines that you can draw between ancient sites. And some believe that they are incredibly significant, holding ancient energy and things like that. When Dickie whipped out his dowsing rods and got to it, he found several on the property. One running directly underneath the downstairs toilet, another right under the electric box, and then those lines actually crossed in the barn. And if that was true, it would explain a lot, including the toilet buckling, the meter draining, and even Lucinda the pig turning savage in that very barn. But Dickie also told them that these aren't normal ley lines. Ley lines are usually just energy, neither inherently good or bad, just neutral. But a bit like a stream running red with blood after a battle, ley lines can sometimes become contaminated when something horrific goes down on the land. And if that happens, there's literally nothing you can do. You just need to move. Just get out, because that negativity will kill you eventually. I'm pretty sure one of our neighbours said something similar to us when we complained about how our garden was overrun with bindweed. But anyway, that's what he was saying, and that does lean towards there being more than just a poltergeist or haunted house going on here, right? And with all of these ley lines in the area, maybe it was more about the Heol Fanog estate in its entirety. The historian that Liz spoke to about Marion, she said that she found a lot of the farms in the area, farms that would have been on the manor's estate at one time, they all had bad luck. No one seemed to live happily ever after here. It was just an unusual amount of death, of financial problems and violence, and none more so than at the nearby farm where Brecken's bloodiest axe murder took place in 1848, because a farm labourer called Thomas Edwards was attacked by his friend James Griffiths. James had waited until his back was turned before striking Thomas in the head, and it became pretty clear quite quickly that James had been the murderer and he'd just dumped Thomas's body in the dung heap. Like, it wasn't really hidden, that is a bit of a stretch to say. But the reason for the crime was ruled as a robbery, as Thomas had had a few pennies on him that had been taken. But really? That doesn't seem like it would have been reason to hit your mate over the head with an axe. But during his trial, James didn't say anything at all to his defence, and he was found guilty within 10 minutes and sentenced to death. And so a lot of people draw conclusions about that level of violence. Was James being affected by something on the land? Maybe the contaminated ley lines? Because that just seems like a 0 to 100 kind of reaction to go to that level of brutality. Or was James's reaction something more akin to what Eddie Burks had picked up on when he tuned into the energy of those two young men, where the reason had been that the murder had been committed to cover up for the manor lord? So was James Griffiths just the fall guy for the lord, left to hang just to tie up those loose ends, while the true evil, the rituals, the sacrifices, could carry on at the manor? Because witchcraft is a huge part of folklore, especially around the Brecon Beacons. So maybe it could have been for some ritual gone wrong, or depending on the intention gone right, that left something dark around Heol Fanog. Not to mention Bill's own brush with witchcraft, in the ritual that he backed out halfway through. You can't tell me that backing out once that door has been opened means that the door automatically closes. But regardless of all of that, for all of the rituals and the ley lines and the energies and the intentions, I'm gonna circle back to the whole taking literal gravestones and using them as building material for your barn conversion. I think I can just make a blanket statement and say, don't do that. You will get ghosts, and they're going to be angry, rightfully so. But some people think that the explanation came from much further afield, because before moving into Heol Fanog, the family visited the Great Pyramid of Giza, and inside the burial chamber, Bill and Liz saw strange blue-white lights shimmering along the walls. The same kind of lights that Liz later reported seeing in the barn. Remember I told you to lock that in your brain box? But along with them came this oppressive, dangerous atmosphere, like their lives were at risk. So could an ancient Egyptian curse have followed them back to Wales? I know, it sounds far-fetched, But then again, the things that I've told you about with this case, yeah. But maybe the underlying explanation to this entire case wasn't anything to do with curses, with the land or stolen gravestones. Maybe it really was just the people. The current owners of the house haven't experienced anything here in the over 25 years that they've been living there. Exactly how the tenant before the Riches, Bridget Buscombe, described her time in the house. So it seems to be something connected to the Riches specifically. And so it's worth mentioning, this is obviously a favourite that hardcore skeptics like to roll out whenever a case like this comes up. And if this is you, that is totally fine. I completely understand where you're coming from. But it's that the Riches made it all up. Bill, this struggling artist, needed money and notoriety to help his business during the recession. I can see the logic tracks, alright? But I just don't know. Although, obviously, yes, Liz has taken part with Danny Robbins in that BBC radio production podcast thing, The Witch Farm. And apparently she has also written a book that is yet to be published. So, yeah, okay. But also, I don't buy that they made the whole thing up. They didn't walk away rich. They were flat broke for years and only moved out once Liz inherited some money. They didn't walk away famous, aside from a couple of newspaper articles and then a book that was published in 1996. That was the extent of it. Bill ended up broken, completely lost to drink. Liz apparently burned most of her photos from Heol Fanog because she didn't want to be reminded of it. So I don't know. If it was a scam, it was a pretty bad one, and I'm sure that there are easier ways to get rich and famous. And that is saying something. But this is the thing about the story of Heol Fanog. There are so many different angles, different ways of looking at this, and it's really just going to come down to you and your belief systems as to what you think went on. Whether you believe it was an ancient entity summoned by a ritual performed millennia ago, whether it was the energy of a family under stress, whether it was all just completely made up to try and make some money, or whether you think it was something else entirely, please do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because my thoughts, I don't think the Riches made it all up. Not a scam. I do think something paranormal was happening in that house. And like so many cases, maybe it was triggered by Lawrence hitting puberty. That kind of emotional energy seems to be just jet fuel for this kind of stuff. But whatever it was had been there long before the Riches, because Marion being so scared that she needed an exorcism in the 60s. I did actually love one of your theories from last week though, that Marion wasn't anything to do with the evil presence at all, but that she was a protector watching over the kids, which makes total sense, especially with her always being spotted near Ben. But do I think that every single detail played out exactly as described? Probably not. Memories are not the most reliable. Trauma, especially when you're sleep deprived, will change your perception. And when you're broke, exhausted, and literally terrified of your own home, your brain will inevitably start to connect every bad thing back to the haunting. Lucinda going feral, the cursed painting, the bills, even Lawrence's behaviour. It would all kind of bleed together and feel like part of one big nightmare. But yeah, the gravestones in the walls probably didn't help from a paranormal energetic standpoint, but also once you know that they're there, every slam or shadow will instantly just feel 10 times more haunted. So for me, the bottom line is that there was something on that land. Some energy, and not good energy either. Maybe it was from the ley lines, maybe a ritual, a curse, or the nearby murder. But then you add into that the Riches and Bill's divorce, the new baby, money struggles, a teenage boy and meltdown. Energetically, I think all of that together just made a perfect storm. That to me explains why the tenants before and after lived there with nothing but peace and quiet, save for the birds. So yeah, that's what I'm kind of leaning towards. But personally, what I think made the whole thing so much worse was when they put out the newspaper articles and opened up this revolving door of psychic mediums and dowsers and priests and quote-unquote experts, each adding their own spin and their own thoughts and opinions and ideas. I know that in that desperate situation you're just going to want as many answers or possible explanations as possible, but I do feel like that possibly worked against them, with instead of getting clarity, the Riches just became more and more confused as the activity around them kept on getting worse. But even saying that, I still probably would have done exactly what they did in that situation, in that I just want everyone to come to my house, tell me that I'm not going mad and that things are happening, and also how do I get rid of the things that are happening. But anyway, that is enough from me. Hopefully I've got my point across. Tell me your thoughts though, your opinions, your theories, ideas, questions too, because maybe there is something that I haven't answered that I may be able to in the comments. And I know a lot of people are probably thinking, well, why didn't they just move? But the reality is, from what was recorded at the time and even Liz's interviews and things, they literally couldn't. Houses in that area were ridiculously expensive, hundreds of pounds a week compared to the 50 that they were paying at Heol Fanog. On top of that, the electricity company wouldn't budge. They swore nothing was wrong with the meter, so the Riches were stuck paying these astronomical bills. They did try escaping to Liz's mum's house when things got really bad, but with young kids, that just wasn't gonna be ever a permanent option. So in a very real sense, they were trapped at Heol Fanog with whatever it was that was haunting them. And it stayed that way until Liz inherited the money from her grandfather, which finally gave them a way out. But if you want to go away and research more about the case, The Witch Farm, wherever you get your podcasts, is a great place to start. And then Mark Chadbourn's book Testimony, that has so much more information in it. When Liz's book comes out though, that may be enough to make me start a Don't Scare Claire book club just for that release, because I cannot wait to read it and scare myself silly all over again. But if you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed putting it together, which it was a lot, I really enjoyed this one, please do give it a like. And if you haven't already, maybe you'd like to hit the subscribe button too while you're down there. I'd love to see you for another story sometime. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water and try not to think about all of the terrifying things that the Riches saw in their kitchen while you're pouring it. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Ernie would like to say thank you very much for all of the well wishes last week. He is feeling much better now.